What's up, Pole Gang? What's poppin'? We're here doing Soundbite Sundays on this Sunday with my boy and host, Graham Swaney, and Dante the Italian Vignuzzi. Welcome. How are you doing, boys?
I just realized that my icon is literally a Cursed Thomas and a
Cursed Thomas,
and a PS4 moniker. So that's where we're at.
Yeah, the quality of this is insane. Dante, what's popping? I did say what's popping, and you didn't respond.
How would I do such a thing, honestly? Like, I mean, you know what? If Graham's logo is just like a Cursed Thomas the Tank Engine, I'm just like an advertisement for Truk. Truk, you should go there, visit sometimes. The Federated States of Micronesia is actually really lovely this time of year.
Yes, so this is our attempt at being a bit more informal and sort of discussing like a lot of the topics that we covered in the month. Unfortunately, we only did two topics this month because Swaney decided to go to Maine. How was Maine, Swaney? Was it better than recording a low-quality podcast?
I'm not going to lie,
talk show thing?
I did enjoy the national park. We stayed away from people. It was nice.
Yes. Yeah, so just to like start us off, we did we covered the protests, specifically asking the question of whether the sort of more let's say the more violent, or not violent, but the more riotous aspect of the protests was okay or good for the movement. We talked about that. What did we learn from that episode, Swaney? I realize I may have... Yeah, what did we learn from that episode?
Well, I kind of covered this at the beginning of the second episode, but I got to actually have some conversations with some black friends, which sounds like tokenism, but...
Hell yeah.
It really wasn't. I actually, we got to talk about sourcing. So I think for like future episodes, if this is kind of going to be a post-mort, something I want to do is like make sure we're like getting sources like who are on the ground, and that'll be tough. But the more we can do it, I think it'll improve our work. And then also apparently the word looting has some tough connotations. So like working around that, and I think like the question we essentially wanted to ask was like, are peaceful protests effective? And I think we did get after that, but like I think that was, just being like a little more careful in the titling's good.
We didn't. I feel like I was the only person who really answered that question. Dante, you and Graham, do you think they're effective?
Quite frankly, I think that peace.
Oh well, I'm neutral.
I think personally, peaceful protests in many respects can be a very important part of the protesting process, because without peaceful protests, it just becomes incredibly easy to spin protests any which way. Like, you do need a reasonable element. If you're not going into complete revolution, you do need at least some peaceful element. Otherwise, it's really difficult to sell the optics of your protest. And I think fundamentally the optics is one of the most important parts of any given protest, especially in some respects, the fact the media is more likely to misinterpret or misrepresent whatever your movement is going to be about. Like, if you take it as an example, one of the most effective protests was perhaps during the civil rights movement in Birmingham, where MLK basically asked demonstrators to protest as part of the movement, and many civil rights activists had organized this protest. But what made it so effective was that the police were using extremely brutal tactics against peaceful demonstrators. When news of that showed up on the TV in unequivocal detail, that was what galvanized the United States into believing that civil rights was an issue, going from an absolutely small percentage of the United States believing that to a majority talking point overnight.
So to an extent, like, protests are heavily reliant on their own PR, but they're relatively disorganized compared to like a company taking a stance. It's so how does a protest organize itself to sort of send that sort of message
Well, I think you hit the challenge right on the head there, and I think without necessarily weighing in too far one way or the other, I think that is a real challenge for these movements, because you both have to. Especially with the Black Lives Matter movement, they're in an incredibly volatile media environment. Where there's just so many layers of racism entrenched in all these different media outlets, and then the way we talk about this, and the verbs we choose, and which politicians get to say what. So on the one hand, there is the temptation to try to sell yourself to the media, where that is almost that can be argued that that is an effective tactic, where it's you have to be seen as the peaceful protester, and you have to sell that image. But I think also the Black Lives Matter movement is probably about more than just challenging. It's about more than just selling themselves at calling out to America and trying to recognize the victimhood that Black communities have faced at the hands of these, that these police departments. But they also have a responsibility to challenge these narratives and say, why is it that, police violence is privileged as, law and order, whereas, protests that inevitably destroyed some private property, why is that seen as illegitimate? So I think it begs the question, like, do you cater to the media, which has that kind of influence in the country, or is your strategy to actively challenge the media? And I think that's an open question that I'd love to hear more like Black voices on, and I'd love to hear like people in the Black Lives Matter movement weigh in on, for sure.
Speaking of sort of like the destruction of property, I feel like I have participated and noticed a growing culture that is sort of spawned out of the fact that we live in like such an interconnected like social media world. Protest streams. I know for a fact that a few of you have joined me in both of you have at least joined me in like watching some of the streams, where it's kind of like the world's like a big reality TV event where there's like six different screens, and it's all just protests. Like one of them has audio on, but it's like this weird information overload. Like you're consuming the revolution from your the
revolution will be live streamed.
Yes, it also led to some really interesting, funny people too. So like Robert Evans for one, and the Sacred Fence, great meme.
Mm-hmm. Well, like you said though, like on that, media still has a lot of play in America and elsewhere in the world, but I think the dynamics as we saw in Arab Spring continue to play out in modern protests in the United States, whereby you don't have to consume it directly from media sources, and that's kind of what kicked the whole thing off. Was George Floyd was originally filmed on a cell phone, and that is kind of the power of technology these days, is the ability to instantly share that from the perspective of anyone. You don't have to own a huge production company in order to control that narrative. So you don't have to be CNN to publish that. But you have to have a cell phone. That's it.
Yeah, but here's my question. A lot of people in the Twitch chat for like the stream we were watching were like low like kind of enjoying it, or it was more of entertainment to them than like a place to really spread discussion. So here's the question: is it okay to be entertained by watching protests, or are you supposed to have some sort of other feeling towards it? Is it supposed to like change, move you into action, or is the fact that the protest is kind of being watched by a lot of people as like this reality TV show a bad thing?
I mean, as it stands already, one important consideration is we should look back to say how does TV function and things like that. Like, I mean, the idea of reality as entertainment, especially when it comes to news and things like that, has always been the case, where people can sometimes not so much cheer, but rather treat foreign news and things like that, especially like things going on in other countries, as not so much a game, but as just something that's of interest, and following that in almost like a news junkie style of way. And I mean, there can be definitely something very interesting about it, by the nature of the fact that you are seeing something go down and you're not sure what comes next. And I think that's something some of the protests where you're not sure what comes next. But at the same time, I think news ultimately should be news. It ultimately should be something that helps you inform and better live your life, and I think better improve the situation at hand. So I think that there is certainly, one can have derive a certain level of enjoyment from it. But at the same time, I think ultimately the most important part really should be getting people informed about what is going on, and then hopefully getting people more engaged in the matter at hand.
Yeah, but I think that begs an interesting question about the nature of peaceful protests, where I think a lot of leaders, you had Terrence Floyd come out and he said, this destruction isn't doing anything. But in the face of a system, I think, Dan, you talked about this, which I thought was an interesting point. In the face of a system, and I'm kind of answering our question with a question, but in the face of a system that has not listened thus far, I think we've had this conversation, several times, like Philando Castile, Eric Garner, your race. And there have been these types of protests over and over and over again. But I feel like these types of protests, I think a lot of people draw the comparison to the Rodney King protests. And I think what they have in common is that alongside these large groups of peaceful protesters that are often met with very aggressive policing tactics, but alongside these peaceful protests, things actually have been destroyed. And it begs the question as much as we might not like that as the nature of humans, I think it does cater well to TV. Like burning cars make really good TV. A smashed in Target makes really good TV. Clashes with police make, good TV. And I think, does that get across the point or capture media attention in a way that peaceful gatherings just have not been able to yet? And that's kind of an open question that we're finding out.
I think the media covering, like, using stuff like looting and covering specifically like stuff like what more like acts of like political violence, if you will. No, I don't think political violence is the right term, but you get what I mean. But like the media covering more of that seems to be like it's definitely more what like the 24-hour news cycles needs fuel, and I think burning cars gives them a lot of fuel.
But I mean, what does that fuel then?
Well, that's kind of the nature of the internet.
What does that fuel then turn into? I guess is the most important question, because ultimately, if you're a protester or something like that, or if you're trying to organize a protest, or even if you're just interested in protests in general or trying to achieve a particular goal, the most important question is do the actions then translate into positive change? Because does the symbol of a burning car translate into more recognition for the protest, more eyes on the protest itself, and thus more attention for maybe the more peaceful side of it, or the more relevant of its demands? Or does it then translate into something that can then be repackaged and turned into a hit piece that then that mobilizes people against the protests, especially in service of authority?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that then boils down to like something about like the individual person and how they respond to those images and how they consume the narrative that the media sort of spins.
And just another question that I think is worth floating is, does it? There's a lot of focus on like there's a lot of like agency on the protesters, right? And in the way we frame the question, we say like, should the protesters do it this way? And we're often, something that I got to talk about was. In that conversation I had with my black friend, again, not tokenism, I legitimately had this conversation, but
yes, you need to spell that out, Swaney, just in case.
Not tokenism.
Otherwise I'll tase you.
Anywho, where was I? You distracted me. But my point was that she made a really good point to me, which was that a lot of the time the way the media works is we focus on the protester and like it's like, should they do it this way? Should they do it this way? And we spend a lot of time nitpicking the way they've done it, but in the end, the agency might be on these media outlets, and it's maybe it doesn't particularly matter, exactly what these protests look like. If there is, because even if there wasn't, some kind of destruction, I think a lot of these, right-wing outlets are going to see what they want to see. I think a lot of media outlets will see, and especially in filter bubbles, I think people can see what they want to see, and if that is the case, that maybe the agency is on how this is being repackaged and redistributed rather than on the political expression itself. Maybe we shouldn't be, just going after how these protests are taking place, but asking ourselves like how we're consuming this, who we're talking to, who the source is. Because we often see like these 6-minute packaged clips from these news organizations, but they will make those clips from 3-hour protests, and we have to ask ourselves, what part of this are we seeing and what part are we not seeing? Like, how do we know what we know?
I think that's that's a fair question to sort of like float around and end on it. And why don't you guys discuss that in the comments? All 14 of our subscribers.
I think we have 15. I think you subscribed with your personal
15,
account.
Yeah.
So you can throw a starter comment.
You didn't subscribe with your personal account?
I'm pretty sure I did. If I didn't, I'll do it now.
Oh, Swaney. That's a big gaffe there. It's a big no-no. I feel like you've jinxed our YouTube channel here now.
Dangerous for our democracy.
Dang, it's ruined. It's ruined. It's officially ruined, Danny. We should give up.
Okay, we'll move on to the next thing, because clearly people, don't listen and respect my thing. Now, the next episode we did was on colorism in India, and I feel like we covered a lot with Roopdeep, and despite the technical issues, I think Swaney did a decent job at salvaging the audio.
Well, like a small plug here. AI did a great job. just tremendous.
Yeah, yeah.
Beyond tremendous.
Yeah, pat yourself on the back, buddy.
And but just a small plug, we're going to be trying to for future episodes. We're actually piloting a new audio recording technique where everyone here.
No, we don't. No, they don't need to know about this. Shut up.
I'm going to do it.
No. We're going to seem cheap. Shut up. We're going to seem incredibly cheap. No. This Soundbite 10 is my territory. You don't get to talk. Shut up. I'm going to mute you now. Right. Sweet.
Dang, I hate you sometimes.
We were talking about colorism in India, and despite the audio quality, I think we had a nice discussion. I wanted to float something that I had a thought, like just a sort of a personal note. When I used to grow up, I once wrote, like, in the 2014 elections in India, I once wrote a very scathing hit piece of incredibly low quality against the. I wrote it against technically the BJP candidates at the time. It wasn't very intellectual, and it was very emotional. I was a teenager. Beep me swearing. My mom can't know that. Okay, but I wrote this hit piece when I was a kid, when I was a teenager, and my mom discovered it, and she started saying, like, you know, you might, the general thing that my parents told me was, you by speaking out in this way, you're putting your community in danger. As a minority Christian living in, like, India, they were like, you know, what you say will come back onto the entire community, so you got to watch what you say. And I realized, okay, that makes sense when I was a kid, and I watched what I said. But then I realized when we were doing the colorism thing, I was very uncomfortable, and I wasn't able to really talk, you know?
I don't know, it sounded like you did you left some things unsaid that you want to...
I feel like I left things unsaid. I feel like I didn't convey the amount of anger that I really wanted to convey, because I was scared about what would happen, and I feel like I've not gotten over that yet. And so I feel like the question I kind of posed to you guys is, like, is that normal? Is that okay or is that bad? What is that? Does that stifle resistance to an authoritarian regime of some sort, or what does it do? Like, I try to make sense of it for me.
Dang, that's a lot.
Yeah. Fundamentally, I think you really do need to... Fundamentally, whenever it comes to any kind of resistance like this, you do need to break down the stigma in one way or another. And ultimately, the best way to break down the stigma really is just talking about it. But at the same time, one must also consider the consequences of doing so to one's own personal health. And I mean, that's always what tends to limit any potential change on many matters, is people's potential concern about being ostracized, potential concern to personal health if it's a very... shall we say, politically charged statement. All these different factors here that fundamentally do limit it. But I think, really, individuals should strive to be, as much as possible, open about their political beliefs, and open about their positions and things like that, and at least challenge them as to be able to develop them and understand what are the gaps in their beliefs and where should they be further developed. And I think reality is we do focus a bit too much on what sounds sensible, rather than necessarily focusing on what people do think and how best to translate that into action.
Yeah, I think that you hit your head on the nail there. I think fundamentally...
Head on the nail.
Head on the nail, nail on the head, nail on the nail. English is my second language, okay?
All right. I can't make fun of you for English on air. That's not cool.
Whoa, I dare you, Swain. Make fun of me for my English on air right now.
I'm not going to.
Right now.
You have great English. I've never done that.
No. Do it. Do it, Swainy. I'll be insulted and offended if you don't. Because then you're being patronizing, Swainy. You're being patronizing, and that's worse.
You know, it's like, maybe this is...
Man, I'm really going to be hitting my head on the nail over this one. The ethics are so intense.
Yeah, but I think the head on the nail, correct, completely correct, Dante. I think it's just weird that I still struggle with that a bit, but that definitely helps. Other things on colorism would be just how like it seems like it would be a bigger issue, like more people would know about it, but it's not. It almost feels very contained to the subcontinent or just to India, rather than, like, you know, being widely known around the globe. There always is that little bit of a stereotype that Indians are racist, but, like, you never understand the sort of colorism of it.
Colorism is immensely globalized. Like, if you look at different countries, like, because are you saying that it's predominantly in India, or are you saying that it's
No, no. I'm saying that like we don't even though it's like a part of a lot of globalized like sort of like cultures and stuff, we don't hear
We don't
much
hear
about
as much
the
about
issue.
it, I'd say, in the West, because in the West we tend to have a construction of race rather
Yeah.
than say as much color. Like, for
Yeah,
example, the
exactly. That's what I
Philippines,
said.
it's immensely important, where it's like, if you have a lighter skin, if you have European ancestry and things like that, that oftentimes gives you a
Yeah.
higher social standing than, say, otherwise. And but I see your point there, that it is, especially if we look at the West, like, we're much more likely to say, especially the blood quantum point, where it's like, if you have one drop of this ethnic minority, then you are that ethnic minority, rather than, say, looking at it in terms of shades of a color.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we talked a little bit about this, but I think even in some of my travels, like I spent some time in the Dominican Republic, a lot of it is very subliminal. Like you said, like we discussed, like
Yeah.
it's not direct. It's not like, oh, this race is superior. They don't come out and have that very direct. Because I think in especially in the United States, racism was a very direct process, and we just have that history of like, we called black people colored people, and we put them, we had formal segregation. So I think that construction is very alive. But in places like the Dominican Republic, you just see like the glorification of people through ads, and it's not upfront, but it definitely exists, which is a key part of
And I
it.
mean, in many respects, that's also a very specific element of, say, Spanish colonial policy versus, say, English colonial policy, where, at least in Spanish colonial policy, there was, as time went on, more acceptance of race mixing, although that was especially the case even after colonial policy and things like that. But that essentially created three different groups in many different countries, not all, but many of them, where, at least in Latin America, where it ended up being you had people of mixed indigenous and white, mixed white and black, and mixed black and indigenous. Where in terms of the pecking order, those who were white and indigenous were above people who were black and white, and those people were above people who were indigenous and black, which was especially the case in Brazil, where you see a lot more colorism, especially among people who tend to have more European heritage versus those who tend to have more indigenous heritage
Mm-hmm.
or who have black heritage even.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. That
Yeah,
makes
I feel like
sense.
that. I feel like this is a this is a Carleton political science class. It always goes back to colonialism. It's like yes, the colonial institution.
You,
Well,
you
like
gotta
for
trace
good
the roots
reason.
back to that. If you know,
Yeah, for good reason. But I feel like
it
I've
just
heard
like explains like
Yeah.
a lot of world politics.
it
just-
does explain a lot of stuff in the global south, especially.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's important. That's important to come back to, and we can have more full-throated discussions on that. But I wanted to go back to something you said earlier about like how you felt uncomfortable challenging colorism, because I think that speaks to kind of like the prism um, of privilege that a lot of people have with these protests, and like everywhere from the United States to India, your ability to we have these things like blanket freedom of speech, freedom of expression, but people are legitimately wearing masks to these protests because they're so afraid that facial recognition technology will come back. Police will track down the leaders of these organizations and try to stick them with some kind of criminal charge. So I think
Probably also wearing masks because it's coronavirus.
yeah. Well, that's true. That's true as well. But I think the point I'm making is like it opens an interesting discussion about like what are your privileges as someone who's made it to Canada. Like look at commenting back on India. Like what are Roopdeep's privileges? Like what what I'm saying, because like you can't we often share this idea that I think anyone can speak up, but I think it's important to recognize that different voices suffer different risks when they speak out, and that's a real factor when it comes to comes to challenging these structures like colorism and racism.
I think I'm going to lean more on Dante's side and say that it just has to like you need to speak out fundamentally if you want the change to happen, and like yes, you need to consider the risks, but I
Yeah,
think
I'm just saying-
towards more the side is like if I don't say anything, nothing happens. But if I say something, there's a potential for something bad to happen
that
to me. But there's
potentiality-
also the chance that something changes.
Yeah, but that potentiality is shaped by your privilege, which is fine.
Yeah.
And I agree with the statement that every part of speech comes with risk. I just think it speaks to every person who speaks out in one of these movements will have a different level of risk.
Well, I mean, many of our social rights and what we experience today in terms of liberties and things like that come on the backs of people who, as protesters, whether peaceful or not, knew that they were putting their lives at risk by saying what they were trying to say, or were risking censure, were risking isolation, were risking all these different factors. That fundamentally, like, you almost have to bear it as something, as a protester. You have to accept that there is always a risk to yourself, but that you accept that risk to yourself as a means of pushing forward the Overton window, or just pushing forward what is acceptable within society.
Yeah.
And that's very
God
true
bless
during
the Overton
coronavirus
window
right now, because anyone who sets foot in a protest these days is accepting some kind of some kind of risk vis-a-vis coronavirus.
I got shit on by my brother for that, by the way. He was like, you can't ask people to go out and protest during coronavirus because that's a health risk. And I'm like, well, then I had that very interesting sort of discussion with him. We should talk about it later because we're running out of time on Soundbite Sundays. But, yeah.
It has a hard cap, actually. 30 minutes is the cap.
Well, we're at 27 right now, but here, just real quick, just to end it, how do you think this podcast has changed the way you've sort of looked at stuff, or like through your research? Has it caused any significant change in your life? Dante, you don't need to answer this.
Oh, okay. If you just want to throw that back in my face,
yeah.
I'm looking at my little stool where I film now, and there's a little.
Say something pretentious so I can mock you. That's what I'm kind of looking for.
On it, and it just says like, relax, go slow, and don't say because I basically.
Oh, you need to relax. You need to relax and not say You can't be
screamed,
naturally charismatic, Swainy. You can't be naturally funny and
like
sweet.
A turtle
Dang, bro, you're
rude. Oh.
Let me answer the question. The point was, I basically screamed straight through the first episode. So on the production side, I'm hoping to ease that up. But
yes.
My big takeaway is like I think it opened.
Okay.
No.
That entire last question was no. I don't. We're over time, Swainy. I don't really care. I just really want to make fun of you.
I'm just saying. I'm hoping we can take the podcast. I'm taking this. I just want to say. I think the podcast will become really cool when we like. I think some of the best work we've had on the podcast has come from exploring topics we haven't done yet. So new voices and all that.
Okay.
Dang, bro,
that wasn't a serious question. I just wanted you to say something dumb. So I
Sound Bully Sunday.
Oh, you know what I've learned? I've learned you're a dick. Okay.
On that bombshell, we're going to end the soundbite. Dante, thank you for coming on. Graham,
you're so toast.
Thank you for being a punching bag. That's going to stay in. That's where we end. Nice.
All right, I'm
going to stop the recording now.
Okay, me too.